on Friday with Marco Rubio. Mr. Rubio, great to have you come in.
Glad to be back.
All right, let's begin with some tough stuff, things that we'll get to the big issues which you like, but here's an issue which I think is in the news, and that is your spending habits. When you were running to be the Speaker of the Florida House, according to the St. Pete Times Miami Herald, you raised about $600,000, and they say roughly 20% of that money you never accounted for.
But that's not true. But let me begin by laying the context of it, because I think a lot of it's been mischaracterized. Number one, we're not talking about taxpayer money. Number two, every penny of it has been accounted for. Number three, all of it was spent on political operations, and it does cost money to be involved in politics. You have to travel the state, and there are expenses associated with that. And number four, on those few occasions when there were things on there that were personal in nature and not business related, they were paid for example, directly to American Express. And by the way, these payments that were made 13 months ago, not last week when this story ran or the week before.
Well, you know, here in 2003, according to the Times and Herald, you created something called Floridians for Conservative Government.
Right.
Spent $150,000 on administrative and operating costs and $2,000 on contributions to candidates, but it gave $89,000 to political consultants, $14,000 on reimbursements to you, $51,000 on travel expenses for food, lodging, and airfare, but it never said exactly where you spent the money.
Well, that's how it's reported to the state. I mean, that's the way the law has you reported, and we reported it according to the way it's supposed to be reported. That committee was created not so much for the purpose of contributions as it was for the purpose of traveling the state and advancing conservative principles, and that's what we did for 12 months. In hindsight, Mike, I'll be the first to tell you, I wish we had done a more thorough job at the accounting of it. It became cumbersome at the end, and that's why we closed that committee and opened up a new one that we handed over to an accounting firm to handle for us.
You know, I do feel compelled to say that I know that other people who've served as the Florida House Speaker, Senate President, of course, they create these committees. The committee in and of itself is not unusual, but I don't know that they hired their wife to be an administrator, treasurer. Your wife was a treasurer.
We did not hire her to be the treasurer. She did not get paid to be the treasurer, and the only payments that she ever received from the committee were reimbursements for my travel charges, like airlines, that were put on her credit card, but she was not paid.
And what about these cousins who were listed as couriers, and there was one address for one of these young men that in fact was non-existent?
That's also not true. The address does exist. The address was an address that does exist, and it was actually an office that I used to have. And going back to their hiring, anybody who's been involved in politics and political campaigns will tell you that one of the backbones of a successful campaign are young people that will work long hours for little pay. And on 3 separate occasions, at different times during the existence of the second committee, we hired 19-year-old young men who happened to be related to me, who worked very long hours driving around the state, often traveling with me. We paid them less than $500 a week for the work they did. And I'm proud, let me tell you how proud I am of that. One of them works for me now as my travel aide, and the other is graduating from FSU as a political science major. Hopefully will be working for us in May.
Well, politicians have travel aides. There's no question about this. I guess the larger issue is, and it also speaks to, and I don't want to rehash old news, which is the Amex card from the Republican Party of Florida. I think that the larger issue is what the St. Pete Times said in an editorial is, do you have a sense of entitlement, whether it's political donors' money or wherever the money comes from? You seem to be somewhat profligate in spending money that comes to you.
Sure, but that's not true. I mean, the bottom line is that's why you raise money, is because it costs money to run a political operation. We're learning that firsthand now in this campaign. I mean, anytime we travel easily, it could be several $100s just for a one-day trip to any city in Florida. Airlines cost money. But let me point back to something. Here's where I think the story that's not being told is that months ago, before any stories were even written, we're talking about a large number of transactions that occurred in the process of doing business for the state party. On a handful of occasions, there were charges that I identified proactively as charges that were not business related, and I paid for those charges, not when we were discovered, not when these documents were stolen by the former chairman of the party and leaked to the media, but way in advance of any of this happening.
All right, one final question about this, and then we'll move on. But while you were a member of the legislature, you and every other member of the legislature gets a subsistence payment. I believe it's $126 a day. When you were getting that money, you also had the Amex card from the Republican Party of Florida. You had this other political donor's money, and you seem to be sort of existing on the other expenses where you believe they were justified and still getting $126 a day. Now, isn't that double
With all due
dipping?
respect, that's not accurate. We weren't existing
All
on
right.
it. We were. Here's what. Again, what you're talking about is session subsistence. Every member receives that as part of their compensation, and you receive it whether you spend the money or not. For example, if you lived rent-free with somebody, you still get subsistence payments from the state.
All right, so you were getting
charges,
the money.
So was every other legislator, right? It's part of what you get, whether you incur the charges or not. It's not even itemized. It's part of your compensation. Now, here's the important point. The charges you're referring to during session were political charges. They were for political-related events, whether it was a dinner or a lunch or a breakfast with somebody that had to do with politics. And it's not appropriate for me to charge political events with other people to the state taxpayer, and we didn't.
All right, let's move on to the big issue of